Hello and welcome to Pilates Perspectives. I'm Joy, and today we have Sofia Engelman, who will be here talking about Pilates for the queer community and how we can update and improve our existing processes to create supportive, uplifting spaces for all. But first, let's check in. Let's take a second to talk about conventions, expectations, and moving past them. When was the last time that tradition or convention made you feel like you couldn't do something? How was that experience for you? And did you feel stifled or limited? When was the last time you felt like you could truly express who you are without judgment? Does your identity match how you outwardly present yourself to the world? If it doesn't match, why is that the case? Tradition and convention are not inherently bad or hurtful. Tradition can actually help us make sense of a chaotic and unbalanced world. It can bring us closer to the people we love through a shared structure. Conventions can help us make sense of what behavior is safe and appropriate in our community, therefore protecting us from harm or from harming others. That being said, sometimes traditions can leave us feeling stifled or misunderstood. And sometimes conventions leave vulnerable people feeling unprotected. And sometimes we learn and grow as a group, and those traditions and conventions, well, they evolve with us. When we look at tradition and convention through a lens that understands both its benefits and its drawbacks, we're actually empowered to move past what doesn't serve us while still holding on to what does. Let's reflect on how you express yourself. Is there something you do or would like to do that promotes self-expression? Whatever it is, think about it. Is it something that excites you? Maybe do you hold it back because maybe it scares you? Or is there a little bit of both there? And what is the one small thing that you could do to cultivate that self-expression over the next few weeks? All right. As always, thank you for taking that time with me. Today we have Sofia Engelman, a Pilates instructor and movement educator and choreographer based in Brooklyn, New York. Pulling from a multiplicity of experiences, approaches, and perspectives, Sofia works with queer and trans folks for a variety of purposes, including surgery, prehab, and rehab. She also works with allies, clients with hypermobility, chronic pain, and somatic reeducation. You can find Sofia at queerbodypilates.com or at queerbodypilates on Instagram. Let's welcome Sofia. Okay, welcome. This is Pilates Perspectives, and I'm here with Sofia Engelman from Brooklyn, New York. Sofia, so glad to have you here. Our topic today is Pilates for the queer community. So welcome.
Thank you, Joy.
I'm going to dive right in.
Yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar, can you give us a definition for queer?
Yes. I'll preface this by saying that I think there's some rub or friction just in the act of defining queer or queerness, because for me, inherently, queerness is about kind of operating in a way that maybe can't be nailed down completely or exists on some kind of spectrum or with some kind of fluidity. But for the sake of education, I will answer the question, which is that queer typically refers to the LGBTQIA community, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, asexual, intersex, questioning, and so on. But what I like about the term queer or queerness is that it's allowing one to kind of identify with the community as a whole and is sort of acknowledging that, like I said before, gender and sexuality can operate on a spectrum without having to kind of pigeonhole yourself in one part.
So I love this. And let me take a second to sort of formulate my thoughts here. First of all, for all of those who are listening to me, I'm a little hoarse today. So if my voice doesn't sound sort of normal, it's just coming back after a long week of training. So bear with me. So queer. So I'm just going to say this from a personal perspective. When I came out, right, it was the LGBT and Q was just starting to come into play. And there was a part of me that felt like just by defining it through letters like that meant all of these things were separate but didn't have a container.
Mm.
And so based on what you're saying about queer and queerness is it sort of gives it more of a container for a community. Does that feel comfortable to put it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also saying there's an acknowledgement maybe also inside of it that all of those letters are referring to both sexuality and gender. And there can be intersections there where people are identifying with multiple ones of those letters, not
Yeah.
just one.
It's such a funny thing. You really realize the limitations of our language, right? Like, pronouns also are identity. They're also gender. They're also just the way in which the language is organized. And so now we find ourselves struggling for the right language when actually it could be more simplistic and, seeing more of a community.
Yeah.
And as opposed to all the sort of individual variation. Is that?
Yeah.
I'm struggling really trying to give my own thoughts to it.
I hear you. And I think there's something beautiful about like a catch-all term that then allows one to be like, well, this is roughly how I am and how I feel. And it doesn't have to be that way tomorrow or next year, but this is, approximately where I am. And I don't owe it to you to be any more specific than that.
I okay. So that's actually the next piece that I think is really, really cool is, so first of all, queer, I'm going to say back in the day, was one of those terms where people, like, it could also do harm. It could also be used in a way to be hurtful. And it's more accepting today. And I think part of why I'm struggling with just making sure I'm comfortable with queer and queerness is because it wasn't always a comfortable term to use.
Yeah. I mean, as a millennial who lives in Brooklyn, who grew up in like a New England academic town and went to a liberal arts college and
very
studied,
different experience.
Yes, and studied queer theory.
Yeah.
It's very comfortable to me. I think where I kind of stand with this is like, just don't say it like it's a slur, and then we're good.
But that's almost anything, right? I mean, but that's almost anything. You could be like, you could use the word dude and be like, hey, dude. Or you could use the word and be like, dude.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's all so much intention of how we show up.
Totally. And I think intention is so important. We also can have all the best intentions and still cause harm.
Yeah.
But I think if it's like said with love and maybe a little bit of nonchalance, even like there's like some beauty in the offering of the word. I'm thinking about, I listened to the disability episode with Zebrafish Neuro, and there was this question around like disability first or person first language. Right. And sort of the answer was like, in the movement, like in the disability justice movement, disability first language is kind of preferred, but if you're wanting to be safe, person first language, like person with disabilities or disability, is like the safe thing. And I think this kind of applies of like, I feel comfortable with people using queer, but if you're nervous about it, you can just say LGBT or LGBTQIA and, maybe practice that mouthful in the shower so you feel ready to say it.
That's great. So let's first, let's take a step back and let's sort of give listeners a sense of you.
Yeah.
And let's talk about dance. And then also for you in terms of your thoughts on the intersection of dance and queerness.
Yeah. I come from like a postmodern contemporary concert dance
I
background.
love postmodern. I'm like,
Yes.
what's past modern? Yeah.
We're talking like 1960s, really experimental stuff, like like performance art adjacent.
Uh-huh.
But I think inherent in a lot of that, I mean, a lot of that kind of like early postmodern dance work was like created and initiated by queer artists, and the work wasn't necessarily about sexuality or gender, but the way they were experimenting and trying to create like new logics and worlds of ways of thinking
Mm.
was inherently very queer. And I think dance in general tends to have a big role in the queer community because queerness and transness is inherently about embodiment, and dance is an expressive way to engage with that embodiment and question it.
Well, and then that makes this link directly to Pilates and other, I would say, more mindful methods of movement,
Mm-hmm.
um, because they're so much about awareness and embodiment.
Yeah.
Is that where that intersection came for you?
Absolutely. I mean, after I graduated from college, I was teaching adult beginner modern classes a lot. And I realized that it was sort of adults who dance is not a big part of their world, but it's like something that they're wanting to engage with a little bit. They're interested in engaging with movement. I was really excited about that population, but you can't make a living off of teaching drop in beginner adult modern dance classes.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure
No.
what that looks like in terms of like sales and marketing and
No,
yeah, yeah,
no.
yeah.
And so I I became interested in Pilates for a lot of personal reasons, but as I began to engage with it as a practice on my own, I pretty immediately was like, oh, wow, this is my way that I can engage with ideas around experimental embodiment in a way that's accessible to the general public,
Yeah.
in a way that I can sustain myself.
So let me ask a question as this is going to be one of these things. So I don't know that I really want to share this with everybody, but I just turned 60 and it's just blowing my mind a little bit. Just
Well, congratulations.
thank you. But what's actually interesting is in this conversation, I actually do feel the generational shifts, gaps, and in our current political environment, also whiplash. And so I'm just going to say this, and you help me define this.
Mhm.
Over the years, or I have in the telling of my story often said, um, actually, sexuality was the least and the lowest, or on my ranking of reasons to make the change in my life that I did. I was married, had an 18-month-old son at the time. I realized that this life didn't fit. And that's all, those were the words I had, is this life didn't fit.
Yeah.
And when I think about queerness, and certainly what we see happening with the trans community today in politics is over the years, the exterior container has become more invisible, and the focus on the essence of a person has become more front and center for me and how I talk about sexuality and my gayness, and now as we talk about queerness, and certainly start to really have deeper conversations about the trans community. So is that something that resonates with you? Because when I think of the like dance and modern dance, and it just feels so open, where in many ways the details wash away and the emotion is what comes forward.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, maybe the difference between classical modern and postmodern dance was they were really like the postmodern dancers in like 1960s New York City were really trying to actually take emotion out of what they were doing. And I
Ah,
think that
interesting.
was a tool for them to begin to find ways of expressing themselves through movement that wasn't tied to linear narrative. I think they were
The linear narrative, yeah. And I
yeah,
think that's kind of what I'm saying
yeah,
is like the linear narratives disappear
yeah,
and something else comes forward. What that something else is, how you define it. I mean, that even could be open to the interpretation of the receiver,
mm-hmm.
right? Um, Interesting. So, talk to me in terms of now Pilates and what does it mean um, for you to facilitate Pilates queerly?
Yeah. I'll first talk about kind of like the basics, like 101 of that, which is like in my intake form, people have an invitation to share their pronouns with me. And I don't make assumptions about people's gender. And if I'm teaching a group class, which is pretty rare for me nowadays, but if I do, like, I'm not going to make an
It's hard to
assumption.
teach a group class from a bedroom in Brooklyn.
Yes, this
Yeah.
is true. But every once in a while, someone pulls me
There is
out.
online.
Yes. Or, I'll teach on Zoom. And like, I'm not going to refer to the whole class as ladies, So I'm trying to make choices around expectations and noticing like the habitual patterns that we can fall into and try to create a space where I think like what you were just saying, it's really about meeting the person in front of me and allowing space for all of the nuance that they might hold that I
Yeah.
can't even see from the outside. And like welcoming the unknown of that.
I find myself saying things like realizing some of the things that I say, like I'll be like, you guys. And I'm like, well, maybe there's another way to say that.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
how is that experienced when you're thinking about pronouns and you're thinking about meeting people where they're at? Like, how is that sort of those general throwaways? How do they land? Do you think?
Do you mean if I
Like you
was
say,
to,
ladies to a
yeah.
group, or
I think it's important to remember that even for people who identify with straightness or identify as cisgender, which means their gender identity and expression is in alignment with the sex they were assigned at birth, that even then, all of this exists on some bit of a spectrum, and that even for a cis straight woman, being in sort of like the sensory place in her Pilates class, and she's like going deep and feeling her body, and suddenly ladies is thrown at her, that might actually feel out of alignment,
mm,
even though she like identifies in a more normative way in terms of gender and sexuality, because I think that all of us have different comfort levels around sort of like when ideas around femininity and masculinity enter the room and how we want to negotiate them.
right, right. And
Yeah.
just based on how you said that, you were almost embodying
Yeah.
it, and you were taking your hands and bringing them to your right down through your center, and then you said the word ladies, and you could almost imagine somebody who is actually really internally focusing,
Yeah.
like almost like a screeching halt, like being brought to a different awareness or a different
It's
attention.
a representation of suddenly like societal expectations
Right.
entering into the room, like slamming into the
Right, right.
room.
And that
Yeah.
kind of goes counter to really meeting people and the essence of where they're at.
Yeah.
Um, so you describe your work as coming from a trauma-informed lens. Can you tell our listeners what that means?
Yeah. I really think about this largely in terms of cueing, and both verbal cueing and the more obvious of tactile cueing and how that like relates to consent education. But in terms of verbal cueing, I'm really interested in how we can form verbal invitations that are like position themselves as harm reducing and fear reducing.
Hmm.
Um, I notice often with a lot of Pilates and movement educators that it becomes really easy to dwell on the like what not to do. And often when we're speaking so much about the negative of the what not to do, and we're not also accompanying that with the why of why we're saying that, suddenly we're actually like taking our clients or our students' autonomy away because they're becoming completely reliant on us. And
Mm.
there's a fear that comes of, like, maybe if my shoulders are lifting toward my ears, I'm going to hurt myself. Or
Yeah.
maybe if my shoulders
Yeah.
are lifting toward
Yeah.
my ears, you're going to think I'm doing a bad job or I'm a bad student.
Right. There's like a judgment associated with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really interested in, I like to call it positive cueing, which is not in like a happy-go-lucky, everything's okay
Right.
way, but
Right.
more
Right.
so in that, like, how can we catch those cueing habits when we're saying what not to do and reframe it in a positive sense of what to do. So, like, I I don't know why I gave the example of shoulders away from ears because I don't think that's a very interesting way of cueing into shoulder stability. But like for the sake of following through on the example, if that's something I was wanting to tell someone, you know, instead of saying keep your shoulders away from your ears, I would talk about letting their shoulders drop down their back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that's like a pretty straightforward one, but you can start to think of a lot of different ways and just like pausing and listening to yourself as you're speaking and
Pausing
teasing.
and listening
Yeah.
to yourself. You know, I really, and oh gosh, you want to talk about like feeling ancient. Like I remember in the beginning, it was like cue after cue
Yeah.
after cue after cue after cue. And very often it was don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And you'd see clients just trying to accommodate to this onslaught of information, and actually the sort of just being present and watching and listening and maybe leaning in on what they're able, what, you know, the
Yeah.
ability.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really hard to teach people, isn't it? To
Because we're
pause a
not,
little.
yeah, our job is not to shape people into a mold. And our job, I would hope, is not to, you know, if you're constantly telling people what not to do, and then you've sort of created a situation where to be successful in the space is to get really good at following rote instructions, what you've now done is taught people the skill of how to conform rather than the skill of how to have agency.
Well, which then right from the very beginning of this conversation goes counter to, as we talk about, you know, queerness and you know, agency of of a community, right?
Yeah.
It really goes counter to all of that. It
Yeah.
immediately goes right back into societal, you know, conforming to societal norms.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll speak a little to how I navigate consent and tactile cueing in terms of trauma informed teaching. I think for me, it's really important that the process of that starts actually before someone enters the studio, because even if I do not want it to be the case, there is inherently a power dynamic the second someone walks in to my studio and there's all of this intimidating looking equipment behind
Yes.
me that they don't know how to use. And I am now being positioned as the expert. And so if I'm then in that environment bringing up this conversation for the first time of how they feel around touch, there is a pressure happening. No matter how much work I do to undermine that, they are going to feel a little bit more pressured to say yes to whatever I offer and to defer to my judgment. So I find that like in my intake form or in my registration form, that's a really lovely place to get that conversation started, because then without the pressure of like also, okay, I'm paying for the session and it's already started and I want to get going. And without the pressure of, I don't know how to use this equipment and this person is going to tell me how to do it safely.
Right.
They get to take a moment to reflect and think for themselves about how they actually feel around touch.
So do you have a question on the intake form? Is that
Yeah.
is
So
specific around touch
yeah,
or questions?
it's one question, but it kind of has like multiple parts, which is tell me anything you want to share about your relationship to touch. And then I give examples of, are there certain areas that are off limits? Do you know for sure that actually this is something you don't want offered at all? are you unsure, but you want a continued conversation about it? Sometimes someone might be like, I don't feel good about it at first, but I bet after a few months I will. Let's circle back.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people are like, yes, it's totally fine. That's what happens 75% of the
Right,
time.
right.
But great, now I have that permission. And even then, because also, writing is not everyone's best way of expressing themselves. Some people do want that face-to-face conversation. If I'm working with someone for the first time, then the beginning of that session is still going to involve me checking in to see if they have any shifts they want to make to how they had answered that initially. And then I confirm to them that even if they're giving me 100% permission to do whatever I want around touch, I am still going to ask them about it before I do it at first. And like, it's important to remember that consent is conditional. And the example I like to give is like, okay, if someone asked me if I wanted to eat 3 hamburgers in 20 minutes, and we're just going to say my answer to that originally is no. But then they're like, but what if I gave you $50 to do that? And then I consider it, but my answer is still no. And then they say they're going to give me $500. And I'm like, yeah, of course I'm going to do
3
that.
burgers,
Absolutely.
$500?
Yeah, no problem. Here I go. And I think that, like, similarly in the studio, someone might be super cool with me putting my hand on their big toe, but they're not going to be happy with me putting my hand on their low back. So I want to be clear about where I'm offering touch rather than assuming that it's just a blanket yes to everywhere.
Yeah. Right. So there's continual check-ins and
Yeah.
um that's interesting. The power dynamic, you walk into a room and, there's so many pieces and elements there, isn't there? How many people are in there? Is the room private? Is it open? Is it your personal space? Is it a public space? And then how you approach also from there. When you check in or how do you make the determination of the difference between it's okay to touch their big toe, but maybe I should reevaluate how I touch their lower back.
Some of it's energy. Like if I'm working with someone who expressly has articulated that they have a lot of trauma or dysphoria, or like there's something really closed off about how they're being with me,
Mm.
I'm going to be a lot more hands off and a lot more like I'm going to stay in safer zones first.
Right.
Regardless, at first, I am going to ask the question before every time. If I've been working with someone privately for at least a few months and I'm seeing them demonstrate like consistent skills of self-advocacy, which doesn't necessarily mean they're saying no to touch. Actually, like I'm only going to move forward with this if they're being pretty consistent about being cool about touch. But if they're like asking me questions, if they're doing a really good job of expressing how something felt, or they're coming into the session with specific requests, if I'm seeing that they're able to really advocate for themselves to me, that's when I am maybe going to move on to what I like to call self-narration, which is instead of asking before doing, I'm going to just tell them what I'm doing. But it's still
Mm-hmm.
coming along with
Mm-hmm.
words, so it's never going to be a surprise, but I
Right.
might transition to I'm going to put my hand on your knee, or I'm getting up to come around and I'm going to
Right.
put my hand on your
Right.
knee, or you're going
Right.
to feel my hand on your knee. I know your eyes are closed right now. Don't be scared,
Yeah.
So there's still a line of communication open around it. And we've like at that point have like a pretty good foundation of communication when I
Well,
go there.
it goes to trust in the foundation of communication.
Yeah.
You just mentioned dysphoria. So just first, what is gender dysphoria?
Gender dysphoria is when there is a feeling of like friction or not rightness around how your body is and your internal sense of how you feel your body should be based on your own experience of gender.
And based on sort of your communication style, how does say imagery based cues help support clients?
Um, what I'm most interested in is that I think if we're trying to rebuild someone's relationship with their body, that if we can find new ways of verbalizing how we're connecting to embodiment, we're going to be able to create kind of like a new space between the two of us where they're able to access sensation and feeling and their body in a new way. And so a lot of that has looked like for me, because I feel like the whole kind of like ventral front surface of the body is so vulnerable and also so known because our eyes are on the front of our head and that's what we see in the mirror. But also that's like where a lot of like our sexual and reproductive organs are. And
Uh-huh.
so therefore it's like a vulnerable and gendered surface of our body that if I cue more into the whole posterior chain, I'm able to get people to still connect with all the good stuff we want around like thoracic mobility and figuring out what the heck is happening with their hip joint without me having to ever reference their chest
Mm.
or the hips, which also like I have a lot of feelings about. I think it's when we say hips, sometimes it's really unclear to clients what we're talking about because, like, do we mean the hip joint or do we mean the hip bone, the ASIS, and what exactly is going on? And one is a bony landmark and one is a place that has movement. And so, just like the more clear we can be and the more I find like kind of speaking to like safer zones of the body, we're able to build a new relationship to movement.
So it's interesting that the front of the body, right? You want to. I'm chuckling to myself because I'm listening to all the times the references would be to parts of the chest and what should be up and
Uh-huh.
what should be
Uh-huh.
right but turning that around and actually talking about through the lens of the back body
Yeah.
gives access really and actually opens the body in a much better than
It's a
by
lot more
cueing the front.
three-dimensional.
Yes, through the front.
And
Yes.
like we can use so many lovely props and like apparatus to help people feel the back of
Yeah.
their body. And
Yeah.
suddenly it's like a whole new world because they're feeling their body through a completely different lens than usual.
Some of what I get from you just in this conversation is sort of this really and you really personify it. And let me see if I could clarify it for those listening in, is truly just an openness of your own, which creates sort of a sense of oh, we're going to enter into like a journey, and you offer space for people to say, yeah, I trust this. I'm willing to take this. Let's see what I can do. It's so much of just how you show up in the space.
Yeah.
So in many ways, modeling that, I'm sure you model that for all the people that you work with. Um, it does remind me in many ways of. So I'm originally from New York, and my training was in the city, and we did a lot of somatic work.
Mm-hmm.
And so tell me a little bit about your experience and your background with somatic work.
Yeah. My dance background, because I was like studying modern dance and postmodern dance and like choreography like starting in middle school. Like by the time I was 14, like a lot of like practices that were drawing from Feldenkrais and Alexander technique and release technique and the Franklin method and like contact improvisation were all really like deeply ingrained in the training that I was getting. And what was exciting for me about all of these were just like they were all different lenses and they were all different ways to kind of modulate how we look at the big picture and the granular.
Yeah.
And I think that's supported me then in Pilates to be able to teach the person who's in front of me and cater to them and have all of these different practices in my back pocket rather than needing, like my number one commitment is to the person, and I'm doing this under the umbrella of Pilates, and I use so much Pilates in that, but my commitment is not to like capital P Pilates and the tradition of that. My commitment is to each individual who walks into the room.
But, I would say, and I just really, as we struggle today to really identify what Pilates is, I would say that um, the capital P Pilates is so influenced by that. Joe came from Germany when the gymnastics movement was
Yeah.
rising. He himself was a boxer, comes to New York, and he meets the dance world, and we Feldenkrais and Alexander technique, and all of the Bartenia,
Yeah.
Flaban, all of these influences were swirling around him at the time. And then the first generation teachers, many of them took all of those influences with them forward to meet the individual. That the somatics are so ingrained into the capital P
Yeah.
but I think we sometimes train it out when all we look at it is from that sense of, well, Pilates gives you flat abs kind of
Yeah.
perspective,
Yeah. I think for me, this way of looking at the individual and just like using the resources that you have to help them feels like truly about, or like truly of what Pilates is actually
It's
about.
like the
But
essence of it.
yes,
Yeah.
100%. And I feel like so deeply in attunement with that, and then aware that there's like
That's not the societal
yes,
expectation of Pilates.
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, it really is so parallel in a way
Yeah.
to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't really ever thought of that until we had this conversation.
Mm.
Um, just, for listeners, how would you define somatics?
Ooh. I mean, soma is of the body. So, I mean, for me, somatics, I really think of it as truly any body-based practice that is prioritizing someone's ability to like relate to the self and to their body. So, oftentimes these practices have like a fairly internal focus, and even Alexander technique is really about like the vision and seeing out into the space. But I think about this a lot in relationship to Pilates, and like the beauty of Pilates is we're using props and apparatus to get to know ourselves better, because we only get to know ourselves through contextualization and through
Uh-huh.
feedback from the
Yeah.
outside.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so even in these sort of like deep internal practices, oftentimes there is sort of like a connection to environment that is part of them. Yeah.
Gosh, I love that. You bring back some thoughts about we use the equipment not as sort of an external tool, but as a way to know ourselves internally better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so outside your studio, um, what do you do outside your studio in order to provide Pilates in a way that is accessible, evidence-based, and trauma-informed? And the way the question was asked was decolonial.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I highlight that because I'd love you to talk a little more about that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like I do have this dance background, and I feel like comfortable in the like quote unquote mainstream Pilates world, but I really think of myself as like the work that I'm doing is more so about bringing Pilates to my queer and trans community, and less about trying to insert queer and transness into the Pilates industry, and like hoping
Hmm.
that by focusing on queer and trans folks and centering them, that like the Pilates industry will come along and follow along. But like, yeah, I just think that like my community, that is like, those are my teachers, and there's so many folks who are in the queer and trans community who are figuring out ways to queer as a verb all sorts of other practices and industries. And so I feel like I learned so much by watching how I have like colleagues who are doing this in massage and body work or at magazines or in their like poetry practices. I think that getting to know how people are doing this work of inclusivity in other modalities helps me better understand how to do it in Pilates.
Yeah, you are doing a really lovely job of articulating the service of to queer the
Mm-hmm.
industry
Mm-hmm.
through service of the individual, which is really which is great because I think that articulation is really necessary. It again opens the door to the conversation as opposed to sort of showing up in expectation that everyone's just going to follow.
Yeah.
You need to really say, here's, lay the breadcrumbs
Yeah.
and be articulate about what each of them means. So thank you for that. I think that's phenomenal work. And watching other industries is certainly going to help us,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, especially in work that is so personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, Along those lines, how do you think now of taking it to the industry side of things? How can Pilates and even other fitness modalities, right? How can they serve as gender affirming care?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like this really literal way, which is when people have gender affirming surgery, like what they are trying to do through that surgical intervention is to better align their physical body with their inner self. Um and so there's like this like straightforward like rehab and prehab support that can be needed in that. And I think a lot about like Eve Gentry, like in the 50s, having like a radical mastectomy. And then Joseph Pilates was working with her after
Mm.
to heal and to get back to being a dancer and a moving person. And so, quite literally, a lot of the classical repertoire was developed with the kind of idea in mind of helping someone rehabilitate after breast tissue is removed. And that's so much
Radical
of,
breast tissue
yes.
was removed.
And
Chest
so,
wall was, yeah,
yeah.
impacted.
Yeah. And so that's like so much of the work that I do is with people who are preparing for recovering from um, chest masculinization top surgery, where
Mm.
usually they're trying to really get rid of like absolute every little bit of breast tissue that is in there to make the chest as flat as possible. And there's a lot of different sort of forms of that surgery. Um, but beyond that, like not all queer and trans folks have gender affirming surgeries, but if they do, and if not, like one of the most powerful things we can do is use movement to help them become more aligned with their
With their
body.
body.
Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's the whole thing.
yeah.
And that's what we do just in Pilates in general, just not necessarily through that lens.
Right,
But we're already
right.
doing it. And so how do we do it openly and in a way where we're creating a safer space for someone to be fully who they are in terms of queerness and transness? But like the work is already there, both in terms of like the rehab and prehab work and also in the way that Pilates and modalities like it allow people to know themselves better and feel themselves better and feel like they're building better connections with their body.
Fantastic. I mean, yeah, yes, for the queer community, for everyone. If
Yeah.
that approach to practice is just phenomenal. All right, what advice do you have for queer people who are interested in starting Pilates?
Mm. I really would like to be like, look for the studio where the educators' pronouns are like next to their bios, or like look for the studio where there's a little pride flag on their desk, because there's a lot of those studios. But I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about people going to those studios, and even if the like new client intake form asked them to share their pronouns, those pronouns weren't actually respected in practice. Um, I think that at large, the Pilates industry wants to become a more inclusive and affirming space for queer and trans folks, but sometimes these more superficial shifts don't equate to deeper change.
Yeah, well, I think so I think the first part of your sentence that the community is looking to be more positive and affirming, period. To all folks, all bodies, all and then inside of that, how does how do we how do we align with the individual, truly align with the individual in front of
Yeah.
us?
I think this goes back to what we were saying earlier of like, just stop and listen to yourself,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's so like, a lot of Pilates educators are like teaching, which means basically talking nonstop for 25 to 30 hours a week. And to survive that job, we like occasionally have to go on autopilot a little bit. And that's okay. We need to be generous with ourselves because, like, that I think is allowed for us
Yeah.
to get through. Um, but as an educator, without making yourself crazy, if you can just like commit to just like a few hours a week while you're teaching to just like listen a little bit more to the things that are coming out of your mouth, and like maybe after a session just take a moment to write some things down that you heard yourself say that you're having some questions about and you want to circle back to later, or you ask your client if it's okay for you to record the session just for
Yeah.
your own self to be able to listen back. um I just think that there's like deeper patterns that need to be disrupted for us to be able to align those superficial shifts with the actual change that we want to make.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it needs practice.
Yeah.
It needs practice and it needs self-awareness, right? It needs all the things we teach our
Yeah.
clients,
Yeah.
right?
And this is us not just working against like maybe what we were taught in our teacher trainings, but it's also like us working against like everything we've been taught by our society. Like that's a lot of work. That's hard work. So like I think that also you get to be generous with
Yeah.
yourself, and with the caveat that if harm happens, we do have to take responsibility for it. We are allowed to make mistakes, but we need to um, have like some sensitivity to how the ways we've been taught to teach might potentially impact people.
And yeah. Yes, the language we choose, the tone of voice, and we talk about inclusivity as it's one thing.
Mm,
It's so many things, isn't it?
yeah.
With that, what advice would you give for queer Pilates instructors?
Well, okay. Liberation is not assimilation. So there is like there is a time and place for the closet, like we have to prioritize our own safety, and we can be different amounts of ourselves with different people. Maybe there's a client where you have one foot in that closet and that's just like how you need to cope with the situation, and there's something about them where you're not feeling totally secure in being or showing all of yourself. That's okay. I think like a lot of sort of like the Pilates educator client relationship is like therapeutic, and therapists do a really good job of talking about how they sort of modulate how much of themselves they show the people, like their patients. But the more that within the realm of safety we can be ourselves, the more we are being our own representation. And that's going to create a call for change and allow our own clients and students to feel like they can bring more of themselves to this practice. And, like, That's so sad that there are people entering the Pilates studio and they feel like they have to hide parts of themselves. Like, how do
Right.
they get like all of the juice out of this work if they don't get to bring all of themselves and they're hiding part of themselves?
Good advice. Good advice. Good advice for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Uh, it is interesting. I'm sure if we all just think about it for a second, how we do compartmentalize ourselves, and we show up in each space with one foot in the expectations of others and one foot in, who I am inside of this environment, and finding the places to be liberated and to be fully expressive. Dance, certainly. Now I'm seeing the cross for you
Uh-huh.
between dance and Pilates a little bit more clearly. Okay, do you have advice for instructors and clients alike who would like to be more supportive of the queer community?
Educate yourself. Like practice people's pronouns while you're in the shower before you go to bed. Um,
I think it's important for us to practice pronouns.
yeah,
I know for myself, I default so fast if I'm not taking the time,
yeah,
right,
yeah. It's
to
another
listen to
slow down.
myself. Yeah, it's a moment to slow down. Yeah.
Yeah. Like take time for yourself to like do your research and to do your practice because like the most beautiful gift you can give is to not put all of the onus on queer and trans folks to educate you. And yes, when they're down to do it, please listen to them. But that is exhausting labor to have to constantly like be the one that's trying to like beg people to understand them and respect them.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. And where would you recommend people do their homework? Is there any, are
Ooh.
there any good books that come to mind? Any movies?
There's a book called Who's Afraid of Gender by Judith Butler, which is really great. There's also a bunch you can research, like really lovely picture books about queer and trans identity for like young children, so that if you're a parent, you can help your children from a young age um, understand kind of like the multiplicity of identities that they might come across in their lives. Um, I also really loved the documentary Will and Harper that came out a year or two ago from
Oh, I
Netflix.
haven't seen that.
Yeah,
I'm meaning to.
yeah, it's just like this really lovely road trip across the country that's documented. Um,
That's with Will Ferrell,
Will
right? Yeah.
Ferrell, and I don't remember Harper's last name, but she was a longtime head writer on SNL and wrote a bunch of movies that Will Ferrell was in outside of SNL. And she comes out, I think, during the pandemic, and her and went before she transitioned, before she was out, she had really loved going on solo road trips across the country and felt that now that she was living more visibly as a trans woman, that that wasn't safe for her to do. And so
Mm.
he with a documentary crew accompany her because the idea is that like basically his fame is like her shield. So it's
Oh,
like this really
interesting. Yeah.
beautiful kind of like demonstration of allyship. Um, and yeah, it's just like really powerful and it's wonderful to see like Harper's relationship with her children. And I think just like in a very lovely way, like heartwarming and also like cool to see how middle America does and does not accept the two of them as they
Mm.
journey across the states.
I ask you for that because I do think that the really working the empathy muscle
Mm-hmm.
and the compassion muscle and as well as truly the inclusivity muscle is stories are some of the best ways of seeing people.
Yeah.
And that's also where I think our studios are really helpful in developing all those skills because if we do just take a beat and listen, the stories always do come out, don't they?
Yeah.
In one shape or another, so having ways in which we can hear the stories and see the stories and relate to the stories in media in some capacity, I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, some rapid fire questions. What is your definition of Pilates?
You're going to know I don't want to define something, but
Ah!
I'm going to do it.
I think that's a perfect answer. Totally legit.
Well, I have something, which
Okay.
is just that it is movement inspired by the teaching of Joseph Pilates, and I like to say his disciples, the first and second generation teachers, which centers values of connection and integration and attention.
Fantastic. That's lovely. Um, and as a definition goes, very nicely open.
Thank you.
What is your favorite piece of Pilates equipment, big or small, and why?
I have to go spine corrector while saying that it does have the worst name of any of them because I'm not interested in anything that involves correcting or fixing. So I usually...
I don't know. There's a guillotine.
That's true. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I always, because I have the foam one from Balanced Body, so I just call it the arc to my clients. But just like that supported like spinal extension and lateral flexion and just like getting to lay on it, I feel like can be mind opening for so many people.
I'm with you. I feel you. Yep. Okay, what's one misunderstanding about either Pilates or your profession that you wish people understood?
Pilates doesn't have to have anything to do with how the people who do it or teach it look.
Oh, say that again.
Pilates doesn't need to have anything to do with how the people who teach it or practice it look.
Okay, what's one habit that you do regularly that complements your Pilates practice?
I'm a really big sleeper.
My watch is telling me I'm not, so I think I need to pay attention. Yes, sleep. Anything else?
My movement practice is important to me. I am lucky because I have my Pilates equipment in my own home. And so I try to spend a soft 6 days a week engaging with Pilates or some cardio or some weight training.
So as a dancer and a teacher, do you prefer those moments to be on your own and self-reflective, or do you prefer to have an instructor in the mix or a combination?
For the most part, it's alone and kind of meditative, but every once in a while, I love to go to someone else and just let someone guide me. And I think, like, for me, a lot of what attracted me to, like, the teaching of Pilates was just, like, those magic moments where someone says something in a new way, and you're like, wow, you were talking about like my knee melting and now this whole new thing is happening with my shoulder. And like any opportunity to like get those nuggets from other people is wonderful.
I've already asked you about books and movies. But if you were to turn off, so I'll rephrase this differently. If you were to just like turn your brain off and you wanted to like sit in front of a good movie or a book, what would be your go-to?
Oh my gosh. My favorite author is Rebecca Mackay, and I have put off reading her very first novel for a long time, and I am right now about to finish it. I will finish it on the plane home, which feels sad, but I know more will be coming. But actually, I have some more recommendations.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah. If someone is interested in like an introduction to queer theory, I really love The Queer Art of Failure by Jack Halberstam. He uses Pixar movies as a way to talk about queer theory. So it's a really lovely way in, and it's not too long a read. for Pilates folks in general who are interested in kind of like questioning a lot of the ways we've been taught to associate aesthetic and function in the studio, there's a book by Doran George called The Natural Body in Dance and Somatics. And it's really looking at how in dance and somatics, and I think Pilates too, I think Pilates is really both of those things, we have a tendency to kind of moralize easefulness, and that then essentially demonizes people that because of marginalization or oppression or trauma might need to hold more tension. So I think that book is really interesting if you're a Pilates person and you're interested in kind of like getting into the nitty gritty of like questioning um, how we've been taught to read bodies.
Mm. Hmm. I'm just thinking on that for a second because I think that's very important, right? We make an assumption everybody needs to let go, and that doesn't always suit, right?
No, yeah.
Okay, so and then before we end, can you tell our listeners where they could find you?
Yeah, you can find me as Queer Body Pilates, QUEER Body Pilates. That's my .com, that's my Instagram. Um, I mostly work with people one-on-one, but you can also, I do like seasonal continuing ed workshops online, and I also do one-on-one mentorship and more in-depth like apprenticeship with Pilates educators or educators in training who are wanting to kind of deepen the way that they're exploring inclusivity and gender affirming kind of lens into their work.
Fantastic. Well, this has been really a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for joining us. Also want to thank all of you listeners for joining us here again at Pilates Perspectives. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Joy.